Welcome back to Plural 101, a bi-weekly series on our channel where we explain plural concepts, life, and culture. I'm Crow, the ampersand is silent, and today we'll be talking about non-disordered and non-traumagenic plurality. This video also has a lot of portions of disclaimers because I know what arguments are coming, so I'll be leaving the timestamps in the description if you want to skip the long explaining bits. Before we start this video, I want to make 3 things clear. First, you are free to ask questions in the comments after watching the video, but we know a bad faith comment when we see one, and will not be entertaining sea lioning. 2, we will either delete or pin hate comments, depending on how funny they are, so try to be creative. And finally, we don't support the term tulpamancy for plural thought forming. See our video on the topic for details, linked in the corner here and in the description. But we are going to be using it in this video when discussing the subculture for the sake of being clear and accurate to how people self-identify. The most well-known kind of plurality in the Anglosphere/Western world is disordered plurality, specifically dissociative identity disorder. Our video going in depth on that is in this corner right now. For people familiar with plurality and DID, disordered plurality originating from trauma is considered the most widely respected and believed in. This video isn't about that, but this is a series on culture, not just vocabulary, so we do need to break it down a bit. I added a lot of qualifiers there because, contrary to popular belief within the community, it isn't true of the whole world or even really people outside of very niche spaces. People involved in plural culture or discourse tend to believe that trauma-caused DID is the best known and most respected form of plurality, whether or not they agree with that fact, but that's just not true. People with no exposure to plurality tend to be less understanding and respectful of DID than other plurality, and in the southern and eastern hemispheres, this is even more common. I'm bringing this up to counter a couple myths that people are almost definitely typing into the comments right now. First, the idea that plurals without dissociative disorders who aren't trauma-caused make the plural community look bad. That's not true. People who are accepting of or even just exposed to non-disordered plurality are more likely to respect disordered plurals. Non-plurals who only accept DID systems rarely respect DID systems as plural and consider their identities symptoms. Second, the idea that plurals who don't have DID exist only because of Tumblr or the internet or are a modern thing. Actually, it's kind of the other way around. Just anecdotally, my Thea is plural too and living in the Southern Cone, where spiritual plurality is actually more normal to be open about than having DID. My entire family is actually from there. The diagnosis of DID was made by, and frankly for, white people in very recent history. It was designed based on observations on white, primarily adult trauma patients in Western Europe and North America who presented in a way that psychologists took seriously. With that out of the way, what is non-disordered and non-trauma-formed plurality, and how does it work? So, endo is short for endogenic and refers to anyone who is a system who doesn't attribute their plurality and or disorder to trauma. It's commonly used as a synonym for anyone who is in a trauma-formed DID system that developed in early childhood. That's not accurate, but that's what it is. Today's video is going to be split into 2 types of plurality, with a lot of overlap. First, we're going to be talking about non-disordered plurality, and then plurality that isn't caused by trauma. Non-disordered plurality is exactly what it sounds like. For something to be considered a mental health disorder, it has to either cause clinically significant distress or impair one in one's day-to-day life. Any system that doesn't experience either of those because of their plurality is non-disordered. So if a system is no longer distressed or impaired by stuff like amnesia, switches, and alters, they're non-disordered. If a system has never experienced distress or impairment, they're non-disordered. If they've only ever experienced distress from amnesia, not connected to switches, and nothing else, they're likely a non-disordered system with a different dissociative disorder than DID or OSDD1. This exists because recovery exists, and plurality isn't constant doom and gloom and suffering. The point of treatment for DID and OSDD1 specifically is to no longer experience distress or impairment and recovery can be achieved through remaining plural. This state of recovery is known as healthy multiplicity. And outside of recovery, plurality that isn't experienced through dissociation, distress, or impairment has always existed in a variety of contexts. There are a ton of spiritual experiences and practices, for example, that are plural but also extremely positive and often desired. A lot of plurals never struggle with amnesia or have trouble with each other that gets to the point of clinically significant distress. Honestly, regardless of what you think of how valid plurality outside of trauma, DID, or OSDD1 is, the idea that non-disordered plurality isn't real is violently anti-recovery and anti-plural. It says that you cannot live healthily and happily with headmates, which is provably wrong and provably harmful. That idea deters people from getting help and normalizes some very abusive therapeutic practices like forced fusion. It makes systems who have recovered feel unsafe in our community and unable to share their stories, which could help and potentially save the lives of others. And it's not acceptable or productive to tell others that their experiences aren't valid, that they're actually mentally ill and don't know it, or that they can never recover from their struggles. But really, that's the less contentious part. People don't pay as much attention to it. What they do pay attention to is plurality not formed by trauma. So, let's be clear. Plurality that wasn't caused by trauma is not only possible, but actually pretty well documented across time and culture. There are a lot of ways people become plural, and there's absolutely no way I can cover all of them, but I'll be doing my best to cover the bigger ones. Also, science cannot disprove people's internal realities. Like TW says, if science says everyone's favorite color is blue and your favorite color is red, that's a problem with the science. Also, things like the theory of structural dissociation, and actually any theory or commonly held belief on how plurality, DID, OSDD, whatever forms, is not scientific. While psychiatry and psychology are sciences, no theory on plurality is a scientific theory. All of them are just psychologists' best guesses. Keyword guesses. None of them have been rigorously tested in any way, and none of them proven negative. We know for a fact that thousands, if not millions of people have independently discovered that they were plural without trauma. We know a ton of these people had no exposure to plurality at all when their experiences started. And we know that if all or most or even a quarter of those people had undiscovered trauma, we'd have noticed by now. Buried trauma is not hidden and covert enough that if everyone experiencing that had undiscovered trauma, we wouldn't be able to tell in at least some cases. Additionally, insisting that trauma is required for plurality is very harmful for people who are not ready to discover trauma yet. Contrary to popular belief, if you say plurality without trauma isn't real, it is much more likely to make people who have not discovered their trauma suppress their plurality and suppress their symptoms of trauma, which does infinitely more harm to them than allowing them not to recover their trauma before they're ready. It's also worth noting that most plural people do have trauma histories of some kind. Many plurals who aren't trauma formed have known trauma. It's just not what made them plural. There is a massive number of plurals who remember the exact moment they became plural, regardless of type. Many trauma and non-trauma systems alike can recount this, and it makes absolutely no sense to say that only people attributing it to trauma could possibly be right, especially because traumatic memories tend to be less stable and reliable than non-traumatic ones. Also why it's especially bold to claim people who remember something non-traumatic are more likely to be wrong about their origin. Anyway, here we go with types of non-trauma form plurality and how they work. First, let's talk about created systems. Created systems are what it says on the tin, systems that are created in some way intentionally. There's a lot of documented methods of creating systems, but we're just going through a few of the most common and well-known here. 1. Dissociate a lot. I mean, this one isn't complicated. Many people, if not all, can make themselves dissociate to some degree in at least some situations. Sometimes if you dissociate hard enough, your identity will dissociate. This usually isn't a way people become plural fully intentionally, but people who choose to dissociate a lot instead of finding other coping mechanisms might end up plural because of it. Number 2 is compartmentalizing. Similar to the above, if you keep compartmentalizing stuff, especially stressful things, sometimes your brain will make a special box for those things, and that box just might be an identity. Number 3, spiritual practices. This can be through entering trances, communication with spirits, possession states, etc. It varies a ton by practice and culture, and not all practices will have stuff like this, but long-term consensual possession is often a form of intentional or created plurality. Number 4, role play, acting, writing, and similar. This often isn't intentional, but it's pretty widely reported over a large stretch of time. The original actor for Spock wrote a book about it, for example. His experience isn't self-described as plural, but comes very close at least. There's also an actress whose name is slipping my mind, but I should have an article linked about her below, who also experiences plurality through the characters she plays and has those characters become headmates. When you play a character for a really long time, get into their head, understand who they are and why, sometimes your brain just manifests them as a person entirely. It's common for actors to get lost in character, and this is a form of that. Number 5 is making your internal dialogue a literal dialogue, aka dæmonism. This is a very common kind of thought forming, and the methods can be read about on the demon page linked below. Basically, it's talking to yourself until something talks back. Not all people who do stuff like this are making demons, but dæmonism is the main example and biggest community. The Demon Page's forum itself has over 5,000 members as of scripting, and of course there are demonians who have never been on the forum. 6 is common tulpamancy methods, like creating a personality and interacting with it. This is often very similar to demon-making practices, like visualizing something until it takes form and talking to something until it talks back, basically. Number 7 is immersive daydreaming. Members of Paracosms can be sentient, and because immersive daydreaming is, well, immersive, people who experience it can often create whole realistic identities pretty easily. And certain substances can induce or enhance identity alteration in some, or allow people to have spiritual experiences that could be called plural. Contrary to popular belief, though, this is not the only kind of plurality that is caused by something other than trauma. There's actually a whole lot. One type would be spontaneous plurality. This is when someone becomes plural for no known reason, just kind of suddenly and out of the blue. If we knew that much about how it worked, it wouldn't be called spontaneous, but this isn't a super rare experience. Another would be plurality originating from the symptoms of another mental health disorder. Probably the most common and well-known example of this is in borderline personality disorder, but people have experienced it from a variety of conditions, including but not limited to schizophrenia, OCD, bipolar, and more. This would be an example of disordered plurality that isn't caused by trauma. As a continuation of the above, dreamway systems are coming to be a decently sized community. These systems are formed through maladaptive or immersive daydreaming, like we mentioned above, and because of how detailed these daydreams are, the detailed characters within them, or paras, can become or act sentient. One experience that's also relatively common is, like mentioned above, original characters becoming headmates. This is on par with creative plurality, getting very into a character's head, until they're in your head. Many other kin also experience kin types as headmates. In fact, there's an entire sublabel for this in medium communities. Kin continuum, a system of one other kin individual with their kin types as something like facets. It's also not uncommon for people who get very immersed in media, topics, or people to interject people or characters. And I'd go on, but the script is already extremely long and I'm exhausted. Point is, there's a lot of ways this stuff happens. It's important to be aware and mindful that anything the human brain can do because of trauma, it can do without it. It can have panic attacks without trauma, psychosis without trauma, depression without trauma, dissociative trances without trauma, intrusive memories without traumas, and yeah, multiple identities without trauma. Brains can even make trauma without trauma in some cases. Brains are weird and intensely creative. They don't need trauma to jumpstart anything. Trauma just often triggers processes that the brain is capable of. The dissociative disorders also just aren't trauma disorders, something made very clear by every reputable psychiatric organization and the DSM-5 and ICD themselves. Brains can do dissociative disorders without trauma, though usually trauma will trigger them. And brains don't need dissociation to do multiple identities. All brains have a limited amount of consciousness to go around. It's why systems can't do more at once than a singlet can, but not a limited number of sentient entities that they can have. And it's not just people with OSDD1 or DID whose brains have that ability to have more sentient entities. Anyway, I spent like 3 days writing the script for this, and I completely ran out of steam because it was exhausting. So, I'm going to wrap this up. Thank you for watching. Check out the description for information and resources, and comment any questions. Like, comment, subscribe. If you want to leave a tip for our work, our Ko-Fi is down below, and there's also the link to our Discord server. I'm gonna go edit this and sleep now. Bye!